Thank you to you all for being here today. I'm here in my capacity as an academic fellow with CQ and also as a postdoctoral fellow at Toronto Rehab UHN and a visiting fellow at Brunel University in London. And I've been with CQ as an academic fellow just since September, so I'm still relatively new to the community, but I feel really lucky to be here, and it's great to be a part of a community of critical scholars who can engage in discussion and debate around issues such as this that I'll talk about today. And before getting started, I just have to, of course, thank my mentors who have really helped me to see the insights that I'll be talking about today. So Pierre Bourdieu, my primary supervisor here at Toronto Rehab, and also Wendy Martin and Christina Victor, who are at Brunel University in London. So the content of my talk today has come out of my postdoc research, which is a comparative case study of transitions from hospital to home for older people with complex needs in London, England, and here in Toronto. And as Denise said, I'm trained as a physiotherapist, so I've had lots of learning and lots of unlearning to do as I've engaged with social theory and social science and philosophy as they relate to my work. For me, a key part of that learning process has been examining the sort of ongoing assumptions, the always evolving in-process beliefs about what it means to be a person. And that's because how I understand what it means to be a person has implications for how I understand what it means to be a patient, or a healthcare practitioner, or a researcher, an academic, a policymaker, let alone how I go about living my own everyday life. So many of us in this room will probably recognize the question of what it means to be a person as bound up with issues of ontology and epistemology, politics and history, paradigms, worldviews. And these issues they're messy and interrelated. They all sort of influence one another or co-constitute one another in a process that's primarily hidden from consciousness. And that's to use a visual metaphor of knowledge with which we'll generally all be familiar, I think. This is a process that's largely hidden from view. It's not clear to us on first glance. And this is hence the need for reflexivity. So the best introductory qualitative research courses, in my opinion, include some kind of emphasis on reflexivity, encouraging students to think critically about what they believe about knowledge and the world and why. So in my thinking, it's helpful to understand reflexivity in at least two different ways as it relates to qualitative inquiry. And of course there are more. There are many ways to think and talk about reflexivity. So these are just two that I'll address in my talk today. So first, and I think most commonly, reflexivity refers to a process by which we as researchers hold ourselves accountable for the kinds of research we do. This is reflexivity as a process of justifying why we're inquiring about people and the world in particular ways. So reflexivity as a methodology, or maybe as a method, as a process, as a practical step to ensuring quality in research. Second, how we mobilize the category of reflexivity acts as a sort of a philosophical marker or an indicator, like a street sign, pointing us to the rest of our assumptions and conceptualizations of what it means to be a person. So this refers to our beliefs about reflexivity as a capacity, as a trait of human conscious thought that we believe to exist. So this is a human trait through which we structure our life plans, solve our life problems, go about making the mundane decisions of everyday life. And some say that reflexivity in this way is the defining characteristic of humanness, which of course is a controversial position. So the stakes of reflexivity are high. But just what is this reflexive thought? How is it possible? And I think most importantly, what role does it play in bringing about our actions as researchers and the actions of our participants that we study so closely? And so as I've already suggested, the ways in which we answer these questions are bound up with a complex set of other beliefs that are situated in particular traditions, particular lineages or genealogies of philosophical and practical assumptions about the human body and being. And like a family tree, we can trace the genetics of our beliefs about the human person back to their original crossing of the Atlantic or their inscription in caves by our native ancestors. And when we do that, we can name the traditions like we name a family and have a better understanding of its meaning in our everyday lives and in the research we do. So today I'm going to talk reflexively about how our beliefs about the human person and the philosophical soil from which those beliefs have grown dictate particular ways of thinking about and doing qualitative research. What we understand the human person to be, how we conceptualize the acting subject, has profound implications for the kinds of claims we make in our research and for the kinds of analyses we do. And by either implicitly or explicitly telling people that they exist in particular ways, as particular kinds of entities through our research, we encourage them to act in ways that accord with those understandings. We help to create particular kinds of acting subjects. We subjectify. So, for example, the evidence-based assumptions on which the education of health professionals are based will impact how they practice their craft. So I'll address an example of that in more detail. My central claim here is really that we always need more sophisticated ways of understanding what it means to be a person. We can never stop looking for them. We're never finished. So just for a brief outline then, first I'll read a reflection that actually I wrote when I was a physiotherapy student and talk about the received way of thinking about the human subject. That's the dominant, taken for granted assumptions about humans that are built into most of Western healthcare science and sort of everyday interaction. And specifically, I'm going to link the concept of attitudes to this Cartesian tradition, to Cartesian dualism. And we'll have a chance to chat about that at the end, I'm sure. So then I'll describe a little bit about some philosophical movements that shift away from this dominant received view. And I'll highlight three different perspectives: the practice theory of Pierre Bourdieu, the actor network theory of Bruno Latour, and the embodied cognition of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. So I'll apply those perspectives to an excerpt from my own postdoctoral research and just address the implications of that for the analysis. So obviously I'm trying to do a lot in this 1 hour. I think I will definitely take the full hour. And I just want to say also that these are sort of preliminary thoughts on my analysis, which is ongoing. So I'll look forward to hearing sort of your probes and your feedback and suggestions about more reading to do and different ways of thinking about how these ideas might be applied. Okay. So I'm going to read a reflection that I wrote on the second day of the second and final year of my Master's of Physical Therapy. And just for some context, in Canada, physiotherapy education is a 2-year master's degree, after which students can challenge a national exam for registration in a province. So this is dated September 5th, 2009. Year 2 started off as expected. First and foremost, a reunion among friends. Actually, this is the thing that amazes me most about this past initial year of a professional program. We came together so quickly. This goes for the clinical instructors, professors, senior students, and of course my friends in my own cohort. Our long nights in room 1440, studying for excruciating weeks full of exams, debates over the meaningful function of the basal ganglia, practicing palpations on latissimus dorsi tendons by digging pointy fingers into sweaty armpits, and the swelling sense of pride at advancing through this difficult but rewarding professional program. We've each had our successes and failures and remained committed to demonstrating the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that will earn us the professionalism credits that are assigned each term. Without even realizing it, and with eager and happy anticipation, we've become members of the physiotherapy community, complete with our own language of abbreviations and jargon, settling into our rightful place in the hierarchy of health and healthcare. So I think there are many things that are interesting about that reflection. I mean, I guess I wrote it, so of course I think that. And it does highlight that there are many considerations that kind of demand attention when trying to understand practice and education in the institutional settings of healthcare. But for now, I want to just focus on one bit of it. And I said I want to talk about attitudes, but this is the section I want to focus on. We've each had our successes and failures. We remain committed to demonstrating the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that will earn us the professionalism credits that are assigned each term. So in our introductory classes to the program, and in our course called Professional Practice, we were taught that what defines a professional is a certain set of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And to be a physiotherapist, we had to learn to demonstrate these things in clinical placements and on exams. And furthermore, the most common reason for failing a clinical placement or a class was on grounds of a lack of professionalism. So these things are important. The emphasis on these same categories of professionalism were also recognized by the National Association and the National Accreditation Council, which defined them as essential competencies. So the repertoire of measurable knowledge, skills, and attitudes required by a physiotherapist throughout his or her professional career. So not just any, but measurable knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Discrete categories that can be placed into different cells of an Excel file. So for now, I want to zoom in on the attitudes portion of this understanding of professionals. And I think knowledge and skills are a very important consideration and are certainly taken for granted in this definition. But I think that attitudes will help to sort of best achieve the purpose of this talk. And that's because I think implicit in the category of attitudes and its use in this context is the assumption that attitudes are the things that drive behavior. So if you have professional attitudes, then you'll have professional behavior. And so this concept of attitudes points to particular beliefs and assumptions about what it means to be and to act as a person in this dominant received view that structured my education as a physiotherapist. Now, I have to admit, I've had long-standing disdain for the concept of attitude ever since I was suspended from elementary school for having a bad attitude. However, the concept is built into the very foundation of health professions education. And it's bound up with a whole set of philosophical beliefs about the function of reflexive thought and what it means to be a person. So it represents one of these signposts to the sort of normal, taken for granted beliefs about humans and human action that pervade Western society and also healthcare. So what is an attitude? And what does it tell us about these assumptions? So one of the leading researchers on attitudes is a professor at the University of Massachusetts named Eisen, and he helped develop the theory of planned behavior, which some of you may be familiar with. And he defined attitudes like this. So an attitude represents a summary evaluation of a psychological object captured in such attribute dimensions as good, bad, harmful, beneficial, pleasant, unpleasant, and likable, dislikable. Okay, so there are a couple important terms in there. And the one I'm interested in sort of unpacking first is psychological object. And it was amazing to me in the paper from which this quotation comes, Eisen didn't actually define psychological object at all. And I guess it's probably just one of those taken for granted disciplinary terms in the field of psychology. And we all have those, if you think of something like social structure, which I realized was in the description of my bio. That's a taken for granted term. But so I did some further digging and found a great critical history of this concept of psychological object by Kurt Danziger. And he explained such categories as learning, motivation, intelligence, behavior, personality, and so forth are not natural kinds, but are posited specifically as the objects of such psychological investigation and intervention. So psychological objects are representations or abstractions that categorize experiences in the world in order to prepare them for a number of things. So that's for influencing behavior, for engaging in reflective thought, and also to act as the object of scientific inquiry. So these objects are thought to be stored in the brain for quick retrieval and activation when the situation so demands. And on this view, other psychological objects would include things like a specific race or class, the idea of research evidence, the concept of a patient or of a health professional, that kind of thing. So to complement Eisen's definition of attitude, I found a more recent systematic review that reiterated an old sort of classic definition of attitude that was considered to still kind of maintain its hold over the concept. And this one said, attitudes determine for each individual what he will see and hear, what he will think, and what he will do. So pardon the sexist language there. I think that this description of attitudes helps to illustrate the other key point of Eisen's definition, which was that attitudes represent summary evaluations. So the implication of the attitude construct then is that it's those summary evaluations of psychological objects that drive what we will think, and what we will do. So those are the judgments of representations on which our everyday actions are apparently based, according to this sort of perspective. So to summarize so far, this strategy for understanding human action is to postulate the existence of these discrete categories of relatively stable, binary, abstract evaluations, like metaphorical bubbles that are stored in the brain and are drawn upon to guide action. And the representation of reflexive thought or of decision-making in thought bubbles makes abundant sense when we trace out the metaphor, as we've just done. So these metaphorical bubbles are considered accessible to conscious thought. Psychological interventions are designed to change thoughts, thus change attitudes, and thus change behavior. So that's a key part of this. Thoughts cause attitudes, attitudes cause behavior. So what does this say about what it means to be a human? What assumptions of humanness were built into my education as a physiotherapist? So this construct attitude is considered a defining feature of the discipline of social psychology, so we could look there for clues. And in a critical review of social psychology research by Seamans Smith, who were themselves social psychologists, they claimed that social psychology is a field that still largely accepts traditional notions of internal representation and computation. So, interesting. This starts to provide us with some clues about what that attitude construct implies about the philosophical status of humans. The idea of cognition as internal representation, that jives with a representational epistemology. And that suggests we have a mind that holds knowledge as mere copies of the world that sort of floats above our head. Or it's stored in our brains as knowledge, but when it's activated, it sort of floats above our heads. So Lakoff and Johnson, they describe this tradition of thinking about the human subject as faculty psychology, in which we have a faculty of reason that is separate from and independent of what we do with our bodies. So again, it sort of floats above our head along with knowledge, psychological objects, and attitudes. So I'm speaking a bit sarcastically about this perspective, and I'm, of course, not representing it fairly. I don't actually know how many social psychologists subscribe to this faculty psychology view, and I doubt many of them would posit an ontologically separate category called mind. And attitudes are usually combined with other constructs when used in theories that claim to predict behavior. So forgive the caricature, and just come with me to see my key point here. And that's that this field and its central concepts, they inherit the legacy and the philosophical baggage of an old Cartesian way of thinking, which has implications when it gets applied in research and education in healthcare. Conceptualizing human action as being a function of a finite collection of discrete summary judgments called attitudes is fundamentally a Cartesian way of thinking about the human subject. So I speak a bit sarcastically here because, to me, the way I was taught of thinking of myself as having professional attitudes represents this tradition in philosophical thought that I considered to be long outdated. And it's amazing to me to sort of reflect on the history of thought in philosophy and social science and biology, neurology, and to see this Cartesian worldview still gripping contemporary society so strongly. And just there, reflexively, that's my paradigm at work. So the implications of this view and its mobilization of the concept of attitudes are many, but for me and for my education as a physiotherapist, it was this. See yourself as having attitudes, think hard to make those attitudes better, and take responsibility for their effects on your behavior. So how will healthcare get better? On this view, it's completely up to me, or completely up to individuals anyway. The world around us has no special bearing. And at least that's the message that we were left with when we finished physiotherapy school. And I just don't think that's going to suffice for the kinds of change we need to ensure a morally sustainable future, whether inside or outside of healthcare. Okay, so enough about attitudes. I hope that discussion really just made my thoughts clear about how the assumptions and the concepts of what it means to be human that we have, those have implications for the kinds of research we do and for the world as they get translated into practice or into education. So now I want to talk about a different philosophical legacy of the acting subject that we could inherit that leads to very different implications of how we think about humans and in our research and practice as they relate to health and healthcare. So this legacy was brilliantly named by Paul Ricoeur as the School of Suspicion, signified especially by Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. So what the work of these three very different theorists signified to Ricoeur was a suspicion of the very conscious understandings and experiences on which our beliefs about human consciousness and subjectivity are based. So each of these theorists in their own way laid the groundwork for future generations to take great issue with the taken for granted beliefs about human consciousness and being that characterize Cartesian philosophy and its consequences. So the theoretical positions I'll discuss today, they align with or are at least aware of the insights seen by this school of suspicion. So they respect the insights of these masters of suspicion. One key characteristic of the theories I'll discuss is their distinct effort to provide some resolution to the challenge of thinking about the relationship between the individual and the collective. So attitude research sometimes looks at the moderating effects of a quantitative variable called social pressures, but I would say that that approach represents an impoverished, an already starved view of the richness of this relationship. It just can't be captured in a single quantitative variable. And again, there's my paradigm at work. So by bringing the idea of collectivity or the social into the conversation, that already implies a shift in thinking about the acting subject. When we recognize the power of collectivities on our actions in some way, we restrict that absolute freedom that was proposed by Descartes. We make room for the effects of the world around us on what we do every day. So I'm aware that the way that I present these three theories implies some kind of linear ordering, sort of save the best for last approach, but that's not true. Each has merits, each deserves criticism, so we'll get to that at the end. I just wanted to say that up front. And the first that I'll talk about is Pierre Bourdieu's practice theory. And I'm talking about him first because I think that his idea of habitus provides kind of the clearest opposition to the idea of discrete individual categories called attitudes as driving behavior. So Bourdieu had a background in philosophy, and that contributed to his eagerness and aptitude in sort of stepping back from individual action to take a broader and sort of more critical view on the human subject. Bourdieu conceptualized human action as arising from and taking place within particular fields, a metaphorical space in which the game of everyday life is played. So we're born into a collection of fields, each with their structures of hierarchy and obedience, histories of modes of interacting, ways of understanding enjoyment and taste. Our relationship as a human body to these fields structures the very mentalities and actions we call reflexive thought, the very ways in which we might arrive at a concept called attitudes. So the relationship between the body and the world is a kind of bidirectional flow, a constant and continuous interplay between the structures of the field and the structures of the body. Bourdieu called this an homology. This is a homologous relationship. The relations of objects in the world around us are incorporated into our body. They're made body, to use Bourdieu's term. They're instilled in us as a collection of dispositions called habitus that make us act in the world in particular ways. So for Bourdieu, it's this habitus that drives our everyday actions and that really defines the acting subject. So Bourdieu defined habitus as systems of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures, predisposed to function as structuring structures. So this point highlights that sort of bidirectional nature of habitus. It's a set of dispositions that is structured by the world, shaped and created by the fields in which we live, and at the same time, it shapes how we act in, how we recreate and perceive those same structures. It goes both ways. Bourdieu continues his description of habitus, that is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends. So this represents Bourdieu's questioning of why we have to posit a Cartesian subject. Habitus explains the relationship between the individual and the collective, the subject and the field, in terms of what brings about human action. If we weren't so saturated in Cartesian ways of thinking about the human subject, then we would never think of them as obvious or natural. So I found this depiction of habitus, which I thought was really brilliant. It just implies how habitus generates action in the world, produces structure, which then comes all the way back around to act upon habitus as well. So this is obviously a grossly truncated take on Bourdieu, but I think I only have time to highlight one more point, and that's that Bourdieu suggested the ways of interacting in particular fields operate on systems of capital, and that actually it's impossible to account for the structure and functioning of the social world unless one reintroduces capital in all its forms. So Bourdieu outlined different forms of capital, and in the chapter from which this quotation comes, he outlined three: economic, cultural, and social. Now, Bourdieu addressed the concept of capital to highlight how the relations between people and objects in the world, they're not neutral. They're not innocuous or arbitrary, but on the contrary, they have implications for who gets to do what and how in everyday life. They structure the system of haves and have-nots in which we live. So economic capital here is perhaps the most intuitive of these three forms. It's one we tend to be most familiar with in capitalist democracies. And it's quite simply the amount of money in the bank or the liquid resources we have at our disposal to trade in a sort of market system. Cultural capital is a little more tricky to define because it can exist in a variety of ways. And cultural capital is what makes us culturally desirable. It indicates our cultural resources. And that's things like educational qualifications, a great fashion sense, or an informed appreciation of art. And social capital represents the resources available to us at any given time in the form of the actions and knowledge of members of our social network. So these are the people we have some actual or potential relationship with who we can access to help us achieve particular objectives in our daily lives. So these three forms of capital imbue that relationship between habitus and field with different kinds of meanings. These represent the resources different actors have at their disposal to act in particular ways, and therefore to accumulate more resources to support their actions. It takes money to make money, as the Wall Street saying goes. So for Bourdieu, understanding the acting subject isn't just about how habitus structures what we do and what we think, but is about how capital itself plays a role in structuring the habitus that's the root of our actions in the world. The very reflexivity we so often think of as characterizing our humanness is itself structured by this system of capital. That's fundamental to a Bourdieusian accounts of the acting subject and the social world. Okay, so we're about halfway through. Raise your arms and have a stretch if you'd like. I'm going to. So I'll move on now to talk about Latour's actor network theory. And I've actually really enjoyed reading Latour. I find his sort of flippant and sarcastic prose to be pretty entertaining. And I think it makes sense to talk about Latour after talking about Bourdieu, because the kinds of analyses that Latour is critiquing and reassembling the social are very closely related to the kind of work that Bourdieu does or did. And the big issue that Latour has with what he calls critical sociology is its usual reliance on a concept of the social as a thing unto itself. So he claims that sociologists have been hypostatizing the social, making a distinct ontological thing out of what is really just an adjective, just a description for a bunch of other things. It's just a word to designate relationships between objects in the world. That's what Latour is saying. And actually, I think Dorothy Smith described this best when she said she refers to the same sociological analyses that Latour is critiquing as relying on a blob ontology. And this is one that treats the social like a blob that hangs over individuals. So that sounds like a similar conceptual mistake to positing attitudes as hanging over an individual's head. So I just want to say quickly that probably a thorough understanding of Bourdieu enables researchers to avoid exactly this blob ontology thing that Latour is getting at here, but that perhaps we can discuss that later. So Latour wants to move away from the concepts social structure or the social, suggesting that they provide a false certainty about the nature of the human subject and the causes of human action. Latour wants to, quote, shift from a certainty about action to an uncertainty about action. So he fully embraces a shift away from traditional notions of the human subject, and he levels human agency way down to size. The idea of the Cartesian subject is so far in his rearview mirror he can't even see it anymore. So Latour understands with most social scientists that human action is in some way constituted by something like the collective, but he wants to spell out exactly what that is and exactly how it happens in particular situations. And in order to do this, Latour suggests we need to consider everything. All the colors, objects, distances, lighting, surfaces, spaces, etc., that represent the most proximal steps in a very, very long causal chain. So he wants to take that social blob and break it down molecule by molecule. Actor network theory, or ANT, has become well known primarily as a perspective that gives agency or causal force to inanimate objects, the way the podium and the tables and chairs kind of constitute this talk in some way. But of course, it's much more than that. And as Latour says, ANT is not the empty claim that objects do things instead of human actors. It simply says that no science of the social can even begin if the question of who and what participates in the action is not first of all thoroughly explored, even though it might mean letting elements in, which, for lack of a better term, we would call non-humans. I love it that he says, for lack of a better term, non-humans. So I understand Latour's perspective as suggesting that the extent to which some category called the social may be understood as impacting human action is simply the extent to which the objects in our surroundings bring that effect into being. The social is not some blob above our heads, but is simply the impact of the objects, including people, that surround us. So Latour continues, in addition to determining and serving as a backdrop for human action, things might authorize, allow, afford, encourage, permit, suggest, influence, block, render possible, forbid, and so on. So Latour makes the impact of non-human objects equal to the impact of human agency in bringing about human action. So that obviously implies a drastic overhaul of the concept of human agency. And really, it moves completely away from discussing human agency as a concept unto itself. So on this view, agency and the human subject are so radically constructed by the world around us that it doesn't really mean anything to talk about human actors as a special, distinct category anymore. So instead, we need to talk about actor networks, because all actors are simply links in a chain of other actors, both human and non-human. According to Latour, this is how we should understand the constitution of the human subject and of human action in the world. So Latour's actor network theory I found particularly challenging to understand practically, so I think it will help when we trace it through the example, which we'll get to after we talk about embodied cognition. So George Lakoff is a cognitive linguist, and Mark Johnson is a philosopher, and the two of them have written a few books together exploring the intersections of cognitive science, neuroscience, and philosophy. And they've addressed topics that include the self, morality, rationality, and metaphor, and others. And the purpose of their sort of ongoing project has been to reconcile what insights might be gained from conventional sciences with the insights gained from philosophical inquiry. So Lakoff and Johnson, they're proponents of an embodied mind, suggesting that all human thought and action are based on a relatively simple system of metaphor that's fundamentally built upon our bodies. So it relies on our existence as embodied beings. The only reason we experience thinking and acting and reflecting the way we do is because of the evolutionary status of our bodies. So on this view, despite our common sense beliefs to the contrary, even our most abstract rational thought is in some way referring to our body's spatial and experiential dimensions. Reason itself relies on the experiences of the body. So taking inspiration from their own very actually accessible writing style, a few examples right up front might help. So when somebody expresses caring, they're warm, like the bodily warmth of a parent's embrace. When somebody is mean to us, they are cold. They give us the cold shoulder. So this metaphor reflects the primary and fundamentally embodied experience of heat and cold. Our very ideas of caring and meanness are built upon our more primary bodily experiences of heat and cold. Another example, when we're feeling good, we are feeling up, we are uplifted, we are in a light mood. When we're feeling bad, we are down in the dumps, we are heavy, the world is weighing on us. So the ideas of mood or affective status are built upon our body postures. The more primary experience of a strong, tall posture structures the ways in which we attribute meaning to our moods and our emotions. So according to Lakoff and Johnson, we could increase the complexity of our examples of metaphors all the way up to our most abstract reflexive thought. All the processes of reflexivity and subjectivity that we've come to attribute to an ontologically special human mind are really just the opposite. They're the function of an ontologically unremarkable human body. That's what they're saying. So while these are just two examples, the point is that all language and all reasoning and morality are fundamentally based on metaphors derived over time from our bodies. So as Richard Rorty says, language is just a collection of dead metaphors that originates from our bodily experience in the world. We go about our everyday lives on the basis of meaning that's derived from these bodily metaphors. So one very important implication of this, according to Lakoff and Johnson, is that these more primary metaphors are continuously at work whenever humans think or act in the world. They're literally at work in our bodies, in parallel neural pathways that operate while we engage in abstract thought and action. So Lakoff and Johnson described this. Our unconscious metaphorical system functions like a hidden hand that shapes how we conceptualize all aspects of our experience. This hidden hand gives form to the metaphysics that is built into our ordinary conceptual systems. It creates the entities that inhabit the cognitive unconscious. Abstract entities like friendships, bargains, failures, and lies that we use in ordinary unconscious reasoning. It thus shapes how we automatically and unconsciously comprehend what we experience. It constitutes our unreflective common sense. So this already structured way of understanding the world that operates apart from our conscious awareness, it reflects how the collective human past functions in the thoughts and actions that characterize humanness. So we're not free to think and act however we want in a Cartesian sense, because the very ways in which we do these things are fundamentally ontologically dictated by our status as embodied beings. So just to emphasize again that sort of key implication of this view, even our most detached objective reasoning is intricately related with the more fundamental feelings and emotions we experience. When we're happy and at ease, the kind of thinking, the kind of rationality we think with is different from when we're upset and on edge. And I'm sure we can all think of stupid decisions we made when we were angry that a later self regretted as irrational. And Lakoff and Johnson would say that that's a perfect demonstration of how these systems are fundamentally intertwined. Okay, so we'll move on to talk about some actual qualitative research. So I'll just provide a little bit of context about the study we're working on, and then I'm going to pull up an excerpt, read an excerpt from the observation, one of the observations, and I'll leave us a small section of the excerpt up on the slide and then discuss these sort of three different readings of it. So the study is a theoretically formed comparative case study, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And it's, in the broadest sense, this was designed to take a step back from the kind of intervention and epidemiological work that's been done on the topic of patient transitions and really ask, what are we even talking about when we talk about patient transitions? So that formed into the slightly more specific question, how are transitions enacted for patients with complex needs? So this is a study of the practice of patient transitions. So we went into the study wanting to look specifically at two related issues. The first one was, how does policy impact the practice of transitions? And this is, of course, in the context of how a whole bunch of other things impact the practice of transitions. And the second thing was, how is collaboration enacted during transitions? So those were some of the key things we were paying attention to going through the study. So we used a variety of methods, including interviews, non-participant observations, and document analysis. But again, I won't go into too much other detail about the study, because I really just want to talk through the analysis of a particular excerpt. So the excerpt we'll look at, the observation, comes from a multidisciplinary team meeting. So this is kind of analogous to a virtual ward model. This is where healthcare practitioners from across the continuum of care get together to talk about the sort of transition plans of their patients, with the ultimate goal of sort of helping them to remain healthy and independent at home. And the patients or the caregivers or families are not themselves actually present at these meetings. So in the ones that I had been observing in London, England, this included hospital specialists in medicine or geriatrics, senior nurses from the hospital and from the community, mental health professionals, a general practitioner, a pharmacist, social workers, occupational therapists and physiotherapists who would work with patients in the community. So the participants described the meetings that I'm going to talk about as getting pretty intense because there was a lot of intellectual muscle in the room. So these are very senior practitioners generally, and the conversations tended to be very specific and very well informed. So the room where the meetings took place looked something like this. I always love these like bird's eye view diagrams. So the circles here, they represent people sitting in chairs. There were routinely 20 or more people, so the room got pretty crowded. And on this day, there were exactly 20. The solid black rectangles are computers. And these computers could connect to family practice notes and to social work notes, but not to hospital notes. The rectangle in the middle is a big table. And the rectangle on the left side there is a screen where the notes would be projected. So I'll introduce the participants involved in this observation. So first is Dr. A. So he's a senior geriatrician from the hospital and very well respected in the community. Next is Julia. She's a senior mental health nurse with a ton of experience in the community. Next is Dr. P, or Samuel, as he's referred to once in this observation. He's a psychologist, and he works at the hospital primarily with older people, and he represents the hospital interests in this observation today. The last one there in this sort of observation who's active is Sarah. And she's a young woman who's a social worker. And that's me. So in this excerpt, the team is discussing the care of a patient, Mrs. V, as we'll call her, and they're debating whether she can be managed at home or should be placed in a long-term care facility. So Mrs. V has complex mental and physical health conditions, and she's been showing up to the emergency department on average at least once a week for the past 4 months. She's got long-standing anxiety issues and currently has a urinary tract infection, or a UTI, as they describe it. So Dr. P doesn't usually attend these meetings, the psychologist. He's here today because Mrs. V is such a complex case. And just one other comment, the senior clinicians tend to get a seat around the table, and guests and more junior clinicians tend to sit around the outer wall. Okay, so I'm going to read the excerpt now. It's a little bit longer, and then as I said, I'll just add the section I want to focus on will be up on the slide. Dr. P says in an assertive tone, "Yes, the UTI is clouding the picture, but I really think the infection is a consequence of the anxiety and the broader situation, not the cause." Julia very quickly replies to Dr. P's comment. "You're right, Samuel," Dr. P's first name. "We need to establish a baseline to understand why these deviations are occurring. But we also need to act in her best interests, especially now that she doesn't have capacity. I think we need to ask if a package of care can sustain her at home." Julia's expression is calm, and she speaks with a calm, non-confrontational tone. Dr. A raises his naturally loud voice, and with a frustrated chuckle loudly says, "No!" He'd already voiced this opinion a number of times. He shakes his head and looks down at the notes in front of him. Sarah then joins the debate from against the back wall, leaning forward on her seat and agreeing with Julia. We need to at least attempt to manage her at home. Dr. A interrupted again, saying in a loud and urgent tone, "But even with 24-hour care at home, she's still going to call the ambulance." Sarah then repeated, quietly now and with less conviction, "We should still try to manage her at home." Okay, so what's going on here, and why did this exchange transpire exactly this way, and with what consequence? So what I'm suggesting is that the different views we take on the acting subject, they orient our attention to different things in terms of how we analyze this excerpt. So I just want to walk through a brief take from each of the three perspectives I've introduced so far. So I'll start with an actor network theory take. And let's recall first that Ant wants to thoroughly consider who and what participates in the action. So this is an observation of a particular moment in time, but the actor networks responsible for producing this action don't all necessarily have to be physically present in this room at this time. So let's think about Sarah. As the social worker assigned to this case, she's been to Mrs. V's house. So for Sarah, it's off-kilter welcome mats, it's half-finished bottles of wine, stale milk, mixed medications on the kitchen table, unopened telephone bills, and the smell of stale urine that leads to her suggestion the team hasn't really made a comprehensive effort to help Mrs. V manage at home. It's Julia's voice ringing in Sarah's ears, the voice of the community standing up to the hospital that calls Sarah's words forth. It can be done. It's these objects of an unmanaged home environment and material support from a team member that speak Sarah's words. But it's more than that. It's the concerned tone in the voice of her manager about this month's expenditures on long-term care admissions. It's the white walls of painted institutional brick in the long-term care residence. It's the sporadic cries from the next room. It's the smell of microwaved mushy peas and the uniform yellowing housecoats of publicly funded institutional care that leads to her suggestion that the team tries better to manage Mrs. V at home. These things all form an actor network, coming to a head at this moment that we observe in this meeting about Mrs. V's future. And what about Dr. A? He basically lives within the hospital walls. He knows the hospital. For him, it's the wheeled cart full of patient record binders stacked higher every day. It's the ward clerk asking for updated discharge dates. It's his misplaced stethoscope left at a patient's bedside. It's the security guards glaring at him after restraining a distraught patient. It's unanswered emails from the psychology department and the director of care's voice nagging him about this one patient's multiple readmissions. For Dr. A, the actor network doesn't include any links that recommend continuing to manage this patient at home. For him, Mrs. V needs institutional care. So for actor network theory, the issue of reflexivity among the participants themselves never really comes up. It's about understanding how and why these objects and people have brought about the participants' actions in particular ways. So the implication of this view is a focused attention to the conditions in which exchanges such as this one we're analyzing take place. It's not about changing the rational thought processes or attitudes of the participants involved. It's about changing some of the many actors in the relevant actor network to produce more respectful, more productive interprofessional discussion. So to understand the human subject, we need to look away from the human subject. Okay, so I'll move on now to talk about a Bourdieusian account of this scenario. And that was strategic as well. I think it's interesting to talk about Bourdieu next, because I think Bourdieusian scholars would take issue with an actor network theory analysis. It seems to leave something out. You know, what about power? What about capital? Why does Sarah lose her enthusiasm here? Why is that allowed to happen? So Bourdieu would highlight the links between the habitus of these participants and their respective fields, pointing to the differences in capital that characterize each one. Sorry. Dr. A's habitus is built upon an upper-class lifestyle. on masculinity, extensive education, expensive wine, a global network of colleagues, and very well-spoken English. He's accumulated a great deal of capital that's embedded within his habitus. That habitus drives his actions at this meeting. It's his aggressive tone, his eagerness to interrupt the conversation, his disbelief at the suggestion that Mrs. V should still be managed at home. So these actions are a function of his connections to a field that imbue him with power, that characterize the extensive amounts of capital he has within the field of health and social care. So they're not discrete, conscious actions, but part of a habitual disposition that flows through his body. Sarah, on the other hand, is a social worker. She's a woman, and a young woman at that. She's been socialized into a middle-class lifestyle with middle-class tastes, who has seen and experienced enough of marginalization to understand what this means for Mrs. V. She belongs to the field of social services, a much less respected and powerful field than that of medicine. Her position within the fields to which she belongs does not imbue her with a great deal of capital. However, she's nonetheless compelled to stand up for her position here, even if only timidly. The meeting is in the community, not in the hospital. It's on her home turf. She treads carefully down a path that's created initially by Julia's comments, already standing up for the perspective of social care. Her habitus spontaneously agrees with Julia and expends what capital it does have available to repeat her claim. We should still try to manage her at home. So again, for Bourdieu, these actions are not constituted by a reflexively thinking subject free to act in any which way. The structures of the field from which each actor comes play out through their habitus. They intersect in a sort of competition of capital in this moment. Here and now, in this situation, whose capital will win out? The hospital and medicine, or the home and social care? So on this view, efforts to promote more respectful interprofessional work require a better balance of capital. They require changes to the institutional fields that structure the dispositions in the practitioners who are engaging in this discussion. Only then can all voices be heard and considered. Okay, so just one more reading and then some brief concluding comments. So we'll talk about the embodied cognitive theory of Lakoff and Johnson. And while this theory does make room for the influence of something like the collective, it does so in a very different way from either Latour or Bourdieu. So as I suggested earlier, it locates the influence of the collective simply in our shared evolutionary structure of cognition and action. So we all evolved this way, we all think and act this way. So in the case of Dr. A and Sarah, embodied cognition would direct our attention to the kinds of rationality being used in this meeting and how that rationality is based upon more fundamental emotive processes. The emotional tone is clearly high in this meeting, and people feel very strongly about their different positions. And that's a key term. They feel very strongly. They don't think very strongly about their positions. They feel strongly about them. Both sides of the debate, the hospital and social care, Dr. A and Sarah, they have pressures to accomplish particular things. The pressure to accomplish those things are linked with feelings of self-preservation, a sense of identity, a sense of success or failure. The underlying drive to achieve those things, to maintain a sense of equilibrium in their lives, leads to their feelings of anxiety that structure the arguments, this discussion in particular ways. So for Dr. A, the pressure to prevent yet another readmission is tied up with his reputation as an intelligent, successful clinician. He must get Mrs. V off his plate. For Sarah, the pressure to cut costs in social services and her felt obligation to at least give Mrs. V a fair chance at home, those structure her anxiety and her felt motivation. She's anxious too. After all the arguments have been made and rationality runs out, they finally resort to this: Dr. A interrupting and raising his voice, and Sarah simply repeating her claim. There's no more reasoning to be had. It's all been spent. Now it's simply a demonstration of the emotions that really underlie this exchange. So for embodied cognition, the purpose might be to understand how these embodied feelings structure the reflexive processes, the rationalities, through which the decision-making process occurs in this meeting. The goal would be to produce positive feelings, a feeling of cohesiveness cohesiveness and purpose among the group, such that those emotions drive a respectful discussion. An anxious, desperate tone would be avoided at all costs. That won't lead to an effective transitions plan. Okay, so just to wrap up. So I started this talk out by saying that our beliefs about humans, about the acting subject, structure the kinds of analyses we do in our research. They draw our attention to specific things, and I think that's the key. A Cartesian legacy, that might point us toward discrete objects, representations, individual attitudes, and decisions. Alternative traditions might point us to links in the chain of an actor network, or the institutional fields that substantiate particular forms of capital, or the embodied emotional processes that enable rational thought. When we attend to each approach, we do very different things with very different implications for our efforts to bring about change in whatever our domain is, in this case, health and healthcare, and hence the need for reflexivity. So one final note about reflexivity. All of these alternative perspectives that I've discussed today, they call into question the very possibility of arriving at any kind of complete knowledge of the human subject. If reflexive thought is simply a function of the actor networks in which we participate, or the variant of capital that we've accumulated, or the bodily emotive experiences that characterize our evolutionary past, then how could it ever be used to arrive at any real ultimate truth about what we are and why we do what we do? So the point for me is not to progress to some kind of ultimate truth about what really constitutes the human. Instead, it's to always search for a better description for our purposes, in order to always avoid the hubris of the search for a final end of inquiry. When we maintain our theoretical modesty, we remain open to the inevitability of theoretical change, and I think that's where the most exciting work gets done. So thank you all very much for listening, and I'll look forward to some discussion.